Now let's talk about biological evolution. There are several periods of investigation, and the idea of biology and the idea that species exist and might not have always been the same really dates back to the ancient Greeks. From around 400 BC, we have texts attributed to Hippocrates that describe particular ailments and attributed them to diet and physiological causes. Anaximander said that life arose from water. So these are early and primitive ideas of both biology and medicine. Back in the time of the ancient Greeks, life was believed to be made of 4 different humors, which may be in or out of balance: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. If you had a temporary imbalance of these fluids, it would lead to an illness or an ailment, which might be rectified. If you had a permanent imbalance of the 4 humors, that would be disease. These ideas are ancient, but they actually persist into our lexicon into more recent time. We talk about people, for example, being phlegmatic. The idea of leeching or drawing blood from people continued into the 19th century, and these ideas hark back 2,000 years to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle investigated nature in a systematic way, developing categories for life, many of which are still used. But just as with the Earth, which he thought was unchanging at the center of the universe, he believed in a static biological universe, and he said that species were unchanging. Galen, an influential Roman physician from around 200 AD, attempted to understand biology by dissection for the first time in a scientific manner. He deduced that the heart pumped blood, and this preceded a discovery by William Harvey by almost 2 millennia. He didn't really understand the circulatory system. Really, biology didn't advance much until the 17th and 18th centuries, until we get to the age of the microscope. You'll recall that the telescope and the microscope were invented in a very similar time frame at the very beginning of the 17th century. Galileo not only used the telescope, but he also used a microscope to look at the compound eyes of insects. But Antony van Leeuwenhoek then perfected the microscope in another 30 or 40 years in the mid-17th century, a much higher quality device. You'll see a reproduction of one of his microscopes on the right. It doesn't really look like a modern microscope at all. At the top, there's a tiny little bead of glass. Essentially, it was not possible to make good lenses at the time, so people used spherical beads of glass to cause magnification, which obviously didn't work very well, involved incredible eyesight to even use the device, and was very limited, but it was still capable of magnifications by 3 to 5. Others followed, observing capillary blood flow, microorganisms, and the cellular structure of cork and leaves. Then we moved to the 19th century, when the cellular theory of life was proposed by Schleiden and Schwann, that every form of life was based on cells and cellular secretions, and also that cells have their own life despite being part of a living, larger organism. Cells, however, with the limited technology of the time, looked very simple, and their function was also assumed to be simple. Wohler in 1828 discovered that living matter is made of the same fundamental stuff as non-living matter, which is to say carbon-based material. Here's a timeline which puts together the major landmarks in biology and geology, and we can see how this flowed through the late 18th century into the 19th century. Born in the year that James Hutton died, also in Scotland, Charles Lyell wrote a seminal book on geology in 1830 that championed the idea of deep time and the uniformitarian view. He was a close friend of Charles Darwin, and Darwin had Lyell's Principles of Geology with him when he set out for the Galapagos. So the evolution of geology and biology of science as sciences were very closely linked in the 19th century. Darwin is, of course, a seminal figure in the history of science. He was an affable country gentleman, quite comfortable, well off, and a prolific writer, but he shocked Victorian Britain by suggesting that animals and humans shared a common ancestry. Natural selection was a process he developed to explain nature, where the struggle for existence pruned species that weren't fit for a changing environment. Darwin was trained in medicine, but he turned to natural science and he honed his powers of observation as a scientist during a 5-year voyage to the Galapagos Islands aboard the HMS Beagle. We see on the left his first evolutionary tree from the year 1837. We also see in the middle here Alfred Russel Wallace, who devised natural selection mechanism independently of Darwin. Darwin was actually nudged or forced into publishing his masterwork, Origin of Species, in a more compact form than he imagined by the fact that Wallace had got there before him. In a convivial way, in 1858, they jointly read a paper at the Linnean Society of London. The Origin of Species came out in 1859. And there's one quote that exemplifies the power of the writing in this book, which is still echoes through time, even though it was written 150 years ago. Darwin says, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into few forms or one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to a fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." That's actually the only time in the book where the word evolved or evolution appears. Darwin's mechanism was, of course, natural selection. It's a mechanism for the evolutionary adaptation of populations to their environments. He articulated two main points on how evolution worked. Descent with modification, that's the progeny of a species having their form and function modified by being shaped by the natural environment, and then the selective outcome of which of the species with their variations survived to pass on their genes to the next generation, although the genetic basis was not yet understood. The products of natural selection are often exquisite adaptations of organisms to special circumstances in the environment. Darwin saw this up close with his detailed study of finches in the Galapagos, down to the level of the shapes of their beaks and how they were adapted to their food sources and the part of the Galapagos where they lived. The mechanism of natural selection can create amazing adaptations over time with amazing subtlety. There is no guiding hand. There is no intelligent designer necessary. One of the tropes of intelligent design is that how could you possibly evolve an eye? Because what use is half an eye or an eye when it hasn't fully evolved? And that becomes an argument for God or an intelligent designer. But in time, as you'll see on the lower right, we have articulated the way that eyes evolved. Originally, the eye was just a patch of skin sensitive to light on a fish or a creature with no other shape, just on the skin. Then, on either side of the head, it would give simple directionality to where the light was. Over time, the flat skin developed an indentation and then a cavity, and over slow time and hundreds or thousands of generations, you develop the ability to build an eye, which has the optical capability of magnifying the light, protecting the lens itself, and delivering the information to an optic nerve. This doesn't happen overnight. This happens literally over tens or hundreds of millions of years. And in the fossil record, and in understanding how organisms evolve, we've seen essentially all stages in this evolution. There's unity in the diversity of life. Take the example of the cilia, these small propulsion mechanisms that can operate at the level of a paramecium, a tiny organism, but they also occur in our own body, on the cells of your windpipe. And it's the same mechanism developed for these two very different functions. We also see an amazing hierarchy of biology, all the way from the molecular structures and the molecular machines to the living cell itself, to simple colonies of cells, to large creatures, to their role in an ecosystem, and then to the global biosphere. These layers of the living world are not independent of each other. They interrelate to each other. Each depends on the other. All are complex, and the relationships are not fully understood because of the complexity, but the principles for this organization are now well understood. There's a tree of life, and Darwin proposed that natural selection could allow ancestral species to split into two or more descendant species, resulting in a tree, as you see here for his finches. Haeckel published The Tree of Life on the right 7 years after Darwin published his book, and it shows the progression from the root of simple life forms to complex life forms at the top. The Tree of Life here is valid, but it's not fully valid because it carries with it implications that are not true. The Tree of Life, as viewed here in the middle of the 19th century, implies humans as the pinnacle of the goal of evolution at the top of the tree, which isn't a story supported by modern methods of biology based on parsing DNA. So the danger of the Tree of Life in this old-fashioned form is that it implies teleology or some purpose or design to the outcome of humans as the endpoint of life. It also implies that we are fully the most complex and sophisticated form of life, and that need not be the case. Also, it's worth remembering, a century and a half after Darwin's theory, the theory hasn't fully taken root. On the right, we can see how people respond to the question whether they believe humans evolved or developed from earlier species of animals. In fact, the question doesn't use the word evolution, because that can be a trigger word for some populations. So the idea that we came from other creatures in the distant past is not supported by many people in the United States. The United States is the second bottom country in terms of level of belief in evolution. If you look at the countries near the top, they're mostly in Europe and mostly in Scandinavian countries. We beat out only Turkey in terms of belief in natural selection and evolution, which is slightly dispiriting. On the left, you can see the belief in evolution plotted against national wealth, and there's generally a correlation. Wealthier, more developed countries have perhaps better education systems and so have taught evolution in the schools. Once again, on this graph, the United States is an outlier, an anomaly. Here is a timeline of the evolution of life on Earth, and all the action, or the important stuff, or the big stuff, things bigger than a microscopic view of life, happened in the last 500 million years. Let's look at the full 4 billion year history of life on Earth, summarized into just 40 seconds.
Those are some of the things that molecules do, given 4 billion years of evolution.
We can run through the history of life. The oldest evidence for life dates back to about 3.8 to 3.7 billion years. It's hard to find life earlier than this because essentially it's hard to find rocks this old. And also, given the violent geological history of the Earth, rocks this old tend to have been tortured by volcanic or geological processes that would destroy the subtle evidence of microscopic single-celled life forms. After 3 billion years of no life form larger than the head of a pin, there's an explosion of diversity in the oceans 550 million years ago, called the Cambrian explosion. Life moves on to the land about 400 million years ago and adapts to a range of ecological niches. Evolution of plants raises the oxygen content of the Earth's atmosphere for the first time. Photosynthesis is invented by biology. Here we see some of the fossil forms that are found in various parts of the world over the last 500 million years, allowing us to do relative dating of rocks in very different locations. Several times, an extreme ice age led to a runaway greenhouse effect where carbon dioxide was absorbed and more sunlight was reflected. So we have the greenhouse effect, but we also have its inverse, which is called snowball Earth. There's pretty good evidence that the Earth underwent a snowball Earth phase when ice caps might have worked their way all the way down to the equator about 2.2 billion years ago. and with more confidence there was another one about 700 million years ago. These episodes of dramatic climate change haven't happened in the recent past. However, mass extinctions have, and here we see percent extinction over the Precambrian to Cambrian history, the last half billion years, and you can see 5 mass extinctions where the devastation that led to the death of the dinosaurs and other large mammals, the KT extinction, is not actually the largest. The worst extinction was the one at the end of the Permian era. In the animation to the lower right, we see an animation of the full history of the Earth showing the devastation of climate change, of catastrophes and mass extinctions in the history of the planet. This devastation of life on Earth 5 times was caused by a mixture, and we can't always distinguish them, of impacts from space and violent geological activity. It turns out that we're undergoing a 6th extinction right now, this one caused by our own hand. Space is a dangerous environment. This shows the impact rate of objects from space and the effect they might have. The small objects of a few tens of meters might cause things like the Tunguska impact about 100 years ago, devastating the size of a small state. We have the meteor crater in northern Arizona, probably a 100-meter across object creating a several kilometer crater. And then there are the mass extinctions. These objects are large, and so they're rare in space. The rate at which they hit the Earth is about once every 50 or 100 million years. The impact is, of course, random in timing and is hard to predict. On the lower right, we see the KT boundary layer 65 million years ago, when we think there was a combination of violent geological change and an impact that we've located to the Yucatan Peninsula and the ocean just off it. In this boundary layer 65 million years ago, you see shocked quartz and carbon indicating global forest fires and extreme deposition of energy into the upper atmosphere. After this, probably so much material was thrown into the upper atmosphere that there was dimming and a complete loss of the food web and the food chain, and then the demise of most large creatures. This was a devastating impact that it took life millions of years to recover from. Evolution has attributes. It's convergent. Eyes, brains, and wings arose in different parts of the tree of life. Are bilateral body plans and central nervous systems inevitable as life evolves? We don't know. Evolution is also contingent. There are so many branching points and random influences in evolution that another set of outcomes, another set of experiments with different starting point might give different outcomes. Or even if there were 100 identical Earths forming 4.5 billion years ago, and biology started on them, would they lead to the same outcomes we see now, 4.5 billion years later? We simply don't know. But after 4 billion years of life on Earth, one species emerged to dominate the planet and venture into space. Astronomers want to know, was this a fluke, or could this have happened somewhere else on the many distant planets we're now discovering? That's the end of this topic.